Love them or hate them, there are cars out there that have saved the company massively. These cars are so important in the history of the brand because we wouldn't really have the companies today without them. They might be hated because there were cars that weren't very good, flimsy when they first released, but actually, because a lot of people bought them, it was really good for the company. And here's a video on those 7 cars.
The first car to save the company was actually the Volkswagen Golf. However, this story starts with the Beetle, one of the most successful and iconic cars ever built. Of course, for Volkswagen during its heyday in the 1940s to 60s, they had wars to contend with and times were tough, but the company had no idea where they were going to turn next, giving it a major dilemma. They'd been so successful they didn't know which car would be right for the people. By the early 70s, they just tried several replacements, including the Type 4 and other variants, but this just never worked out, and of course they scrapped the whole idea. But under new management, Volkswagen invested in a totally new lineup of models, led by Passat and of course the Volkswagen Golf Mark I, also known as the Rabbit. This featured a front-wheel drive platform and straight 4 engine. It seems that Volkswagen struck it lucky, and it was an immediate hit given that there was no real contender for small hatchbacks that were cheap and affordable. At number 2, the most well-known one, is actually Aston Martin. By the late 1980s, Aston Martin was looking pretty lost, and despite its great history with being in Bond films for example, it was on the brink of collapse, of course another British icon. This of course meant intervention from Ford and the release of a particular new model in 1994. What was it? It was a DB7. Designed by Ian Callum, it was based on a slightly evolved platform from the Jaguar XJS. Of course, Jaguar being owned by Ford at the time and for many years to come after that, featured a 3.2 litre supercharged engine, and it was borrowed from several parts from Ford, Mazda and Citroën. The DB7 didn't quite make it into Bond films, however it did make it into Johnny English, so I guess that's a good start. Instantly it was a hit, and thanks not to its only good looks and performance, but its accessibility. It was relatively cheap for an Aston Martin of the day at only £78,500. And it created an entry point for Aston Martin that they previously hadn't been there because a lot of the cars are always over the price of £100,000. A total of over 7,000 was sold, and this made it Aston's massive company saver.
It's weird to think that Aston Martin actually nearly went bankrupt, but because of the DB7, it saved the company.
The next car is Porsche, and this is actually a well-known one as well. It's the Porsche Boxster, and because Porsche nearly went bankrupt in 1992, like other car companies at the time, the German mark rode high, and this pushed up showroom prices of cars abroad, so the bottom fell out of the 911 sales. Especially in the US where the company had been growing, the front engine 928 and 968 were getting old and also struggling to sell, so Porsche had 3 ranges of cars with few parts in common. Porsche had a new boss coming in, and at the time he was a production specialist, and this mattered. In 1993, Porsche unveiled the Boxster concept, and this was an entry-level version into the company, but also was a cheaper version as well, but a uniquely appealing roadster. The 986 generation Boxster was clever. Cleverer still, most of its front half and water-cooled engine would be shared with the forthcoming 996 generation 911. At first, purists didn't like the water cooling, but as the 911 range flowered into multiple Carreras, GT3s, GT2s, they actually fell silent, much like most trends. Porsche used the cash to future-proof itself, of course, the well-known Cayenne, which was also an issue when it first came out, but now it sells very well.
You wouldn't actually think it about the Porsche Boxster, but it absolutely saved the company, and you still see a lot of them today.
Another car that was pretty famous for restarting its company, and that was Bentley's Continental GT in 2003. Bentley had been averaging around 1,000 cars a year because money wasn't flowing the same way as it is now. 5 years after its acquisition by Volkswagen, it needed a success story, and the 2003 Bentley Continental was just that. Thanks to its sleek coupe looks, 4-seat cabin and twin-turbo 6-litre W12 engine, 3,200 customers put deposits down before the car was even launched, and let's be honest, most of those were in Cheshire. In its first year alone, it single-handedly increased Bentley's sales 7-fold, with over 7,000 sold. With a total of 40,000 leaving the production line, it proved that VW and Bentley could be successful and profitable under the same stewardship. You could easily argue that if it wasn't for the Bentley Continental, it probably wouldn't be here today. Believe it or not, there is actually a Chrysler family car on this list, and you wouldn't probably like it and know or love it. However, this car did actually save the company. It avoided bankruptcy only thanks to colossal federal loan guarantees. With the new CEO in charge and the team had a plan, a relatively advanced and relatively small front drive car that could probably compete with Japanese cars coming in at the time. It was the K platform, first made as the Dodge Aries and for the Plymouth Reliant, that shifted shed loads throughout the 1980s. So as soon as the platform being stretched and shoved into upmarket Chrysler and New York sort of luxury cars, but the stroke of genius was a whole other kind of K-based vehicle that, funnily enough, shook up the American family car land. These, of course, were the minivans, the Voyager and Caravan. Go anywhere in America or even Europe today and you'll probably see one. I bet you didn't know that the XC90 is also a car that saved the company. This was first done under Ford's ownership, once again in Volvo in 2002. It was actually a fantastically handy crossover, super roomy and versatile inside. It was a massive sales success for Volvo, both in Europe and US actually, when a time when saloons and estates and sports cars generally were falling out of fashion, and so Volvo in particular were getting trounced by BMW and Mercedes. Funnily enough, this kind of happened at the same time as the KM. The current XC90 is a car that showed Volvo's plans for when it was cast adrift from Ford. In one fell swoop essentially, Volvo dreamed up its own platform, rationalised engines, infotainment and a hybrid system.
The XC90 established its way into SUV history.
Now I have to say, this car technically is very different from all the others. In 2005, Renault was reportedly developing a new Alpine car, codenamed the Project W16. And this is way back before anyone could even bring it to fruition. However, over time and over the many years to come, this car would actually really make its way to real life. In March 2012, Renault bought the Alpine name and used it in the UK. And of course, new pictures of the Alpine Vision was released. Finally, after many motor shows at the Geneva Motor Show, Monte Carlo, and even in Gran Turismo Vision, it finally came true. At the 87th Geneva Motor Show, the Alpine A110 finally came back after years and years of waiting. It was already saving the company back in the day. It was released in the 10th of December 2020 and it's been selling pretty well for a cool sports car from Renault. There's been variations of it, including the A110R and the Super Veloce, and it's essentially a car that has been rebuilt from one of the great legends, the Alpine A110, back in the 1960s and 70s.